This is a story about decisions that change the lives of the main characters, leaving behind traces that cannot be erased. Dive into this gripping narrative and prepare for unpredictable plot twists and profound human emotions. Enjoy observing as the servers and kitchen staff attend to minua, navigating between tables, and organizing the crockery. Alone at the far end of the table, Frank Walker watched fellow patrons savoring their time, some pausing for walks or placing calls. Beverages and coffee were served, and the festivity continued. But Frank was absorbed in thinking about a surprising message left by an unnamed server. The message alerted him to a possible threat posed by Mark Lavalier, who, according to the note, aimed to charm his spouse. The alert took Frank by surprise. Upon rereading the note, he saw his spouse dancing with Leia once more, which made him uneasy, especially when they vanished from sight a second time. Frank resolved to step in, but before he could rise, the music stopped, and he saw them exiting the dance area. Relieved, he settled back into his seat, expecting Leia to escort his wife back. Instead, they approached Mark's table, where Frank watched them engage in conversation with him and his associates. Shortly after, Leia left, and his wife, after saying goodbye to Frank and expressing her affection, made her way to the lavatories. As Frank watched his wife walk to the dining area toward the corridor leading to the lavatories, he sensed something was off. Her statement about heading to the restroom felt odd. The way she paused and declared her love suggested her departure was for reasons other than just visiting the restroom. Frank stood and followed her. After only a few steps, Leia and his associates, just as the note had warned, rose from their table and blocked his path. Frank Walker made his living by resolving dilemmas for various organizations. Weekly, he would fly to different countries to fix problems in companies and organizations that had encountered trouble in their operations, finances, or administration. Frank routinely dealt with egotistical and powerful individuals who climbed the ranks through scheming, bribery, lies, manipulation, and coercion. He faced obstinate managers and executives who exploited and intimidated employees, boasting about their ruthlessness. When Frank intervened in these situations to make changes that affected people's jobs and well-being, he often faced resistance, bullying, and even threats. He had once received threats from a narcotics syndicate for his involvement in relocating a U.S. manufacturing firm from Mexico to Alabama. Yet, Frank remained undeterred, and the move went ahead. Frank excelled in his profession, thriving when confronting selfish, ambitious, and ruthless individuals. It was his forte. So, when Mark Lavalier and his group confronted him, Frank quickly reversed the dynamics, making them feel intimidated. They had never been so clearly told about the consequences of their actions until Frank did so. They quickly moved aside, and with Leia's associates no longer blocking his way, Frank rushed to follow Brooke. Catching up with her, he saw she was heading toward the rear exit of the establishment. "Brooke," he called out. She either didn't hear him or chose to ignore him, continuing her stride toward the exit. Frank quickened his pace, closing the gap between them, and called out again, "Brooke, where are you going?" This time, Brooke stopped, turned to face him, and looked at him with an irritated and inquisitive expression. "What are you doing here?" she asked, clearly vexed that he had followed her. Frank stared at her, realizing her behavior was unusually distant. "I'm asking the same thing," Frank replied. Brooke paused for a moment before answering. "I want—" She stopped mid-sentence. Frank peered into her eyes and asked again, "Where are you going?" Brooke looked away, clearly conflicted. She knew she had to confess the truth, even though it would be uncomfortable for her and cause Frank distress. Earlier that evening, after exiting the restroom, she had walked past Mark's table. He had spotted her, stood up courteously, introduced himself, and initiated a brief conversation. Afterward, she had rejoined Frank and the others at their table. As the celebration was reaching its peak, the band began to perform. Shortly after, Mark Lavalier approached their table. Naturally, everyone was excited that a local soccer player and sports icon had arrived. Mark greeted everyone, shook hands, took selfies, signed autographs, and then invited Brooke to dance. Initially, she was stunned and declined his offer, but Mark insisted politely, and the other attendees encouraged her. Frank didn't object, so she hesitantly accepted his invitation. Brooke was nervous as Mark escorted her to the dance floor. However, once there, she found dancing with Mark was unlike anything she had experienced before. He was youthful, attractive, bold, a skilled athlete, and an excellent dancer. During their dance, Mark's touch resonated with her in a way she appreciated. He held her in her preferred manner and spoke in a way that charmed her. From that moment, she consistently accepted his invitations to dance. As the night wore on, Brooke's attraction to him grew stronger, becoming more than just physical. At the end of the night, Mark led her to a secluded area, where he kissed her, caressed her, and shared his feelings for her. He suggested they go to his house for privacy and to explore each other further, promising an unforgettable experience. Brooke was entranced. While sitting with Frank and the other guests, she thought about Mark's offer. She was torn between leaving Frank at the party to go with someone she barely knew. Yet the thought of being with Mark excited her. She realized her desire for him marked a deviation from her loyalty to Frank. Although she had found other men attractive in the past, it had never gone beyond simple admiration. This night was different. She longed for Mark's affection and yearned to embrace the moment. Despite feeling guilty about betraying Frank's trust, Brooke convinced herself that this was an opportunity she couldn't miss. She justified her choice by telling herself that Mark was not only a local hero, but also someone who offered her a thrilling experience. She believed Frank would see it as an adventure and would understand, even if he was disappointed. At her core, though, she knew her decision was driven by Mark's bold assertion and her undeniable desire. She chose to live in the moment, reminding herself that, beyond being Frank's partner, she was a woman with her own desires. With this resolution, the birthday dinner came to an end, and the gathering moved to the venue for more celebrations. Mark approached their table again, inviting Brooke to dance once more. Frank, clearly annoyed, resisted Mark's repeated requests for his wife. Brooke skillfully navigated her husband's objections, agreeing to one last dance with Mark. "I enjoy the song," she said, pointing out the tune's appeal. Mark thanked Frank for his patience before leading Brooke to the dance floor. In a shadowy corner, Mark asked, "Are you ready to leave?" She confirmed with a laugh, admitting her capitulation to him unreservedly. As the dance ended, Mark led her back to their table to discuss their departure. He reassured her about her safety and promised to handle any concerns Frank might have, trusting in his assurance. Brooke positioned herself at the rear exit, ready to leave with him. However, their plan was thwarted when Frank unexpectedly appeared at the back door, pointing out a flaw in Mark's scheme. He halted her exit, demanding an explanation. "Brooke, I'm waiting. Tell me where you're going," Frank demanded. Brooke mustered all the courage she could and replied, "Frank, I'm going with Mark." "Are you going with Mark?" Frank inquired, emotionless. "Yes, I'm joining Mark. He invited me to his place," she stated. Frank remained composed, questioning why she was going to his house. "Frank, this is too complex to explain right now. I'll call or text you later to clarify what I'm doing, but for now, I must go." "Mark is waiting," she explained. Frank refused to let her pass, dismissing the idea of a later explanation and insisting on understanding her intentions immediately. "Oh, God! Frank, please. Let's not create a scene over this. Just let me go, and I'll explain everything afterward," Brooke pleaded. "No, Brooke. I need you to explain what's happening right now," Frank insisted, raising his voice. Faced with Frank's insistence, Brooke became defensive. "Frank, you don't command me. Move aside and let me go." "No, Brooke. You are my wife, and you're not leaving until you explain your actions," Frank countered. Realizing Frank's determination, Brooke understood she needed to reveal her intentions. With a nervous sigh, she began, "Frank, I realize how awful this sounds, and I honestly can't believe I'm doing this, but I'm going to Mark's to spend the night." She hastily added, "But Frank, it's only for tonight. He'll bring me back tomorrow." Frank didn't immediately respond. It took him a few moments to process that his wife had just told him she planned to spend the night with Mark. However, after gathering his thoughts, he replied angrily, "No, Brooke, you will not spend the night with Mark. You're not going to sleep over, are you? You're planning to be intimate with him, aren't you?" Frank's interruption silenced her. Brooke avoided his stare, remaining silent. "Tell me the truth, Brooke. Is that your plan?" Frank persisted. Brooke remained silent, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I know I'm right," Frank asserted. "Brooke, is that really what you're going to do?" Eventually, Brooke admitted quietly, "Yes, Frank, you're correct. I'm planning to be intimate with Mark." The hallway fell silent. Finally, Brooke looked up and noticed a confused expression on her husband's face. "Frank, what are you thinking about?" she asked. Frank Walker was a man who was not easily shocked, but what his wife had just revealed to him deeply disturbed him. Even after receiving the note that warned him this might happen, for a brief moment, he lost his composure. "What am I thinking?" "I'll tell you what I'm thinking, Brooke. I think this is utterly astonishing, just insane," he exclaimed. Brooke was startled by Frank's rare outburst. She had never seen him this angry, and it frightened her. "Oh, God, Frank, I'm sorry." "I'm sorry," Brooke said, unable to meet his gaze. "Why, Brooke? Why are you doing this?" Frank demanded. "Frank, I know this might seem mad to you, but please just listen," she implored. "I'm listening," he replied. "Frank, probably every woman fantasizes about a romantic encounter with a celebrity or someone wealthy and famous," Brooke said. Frank cut her off sarcastically. "Let me guess. Mark Lavalier is your fairy tale prince or your knight in shining armor. Please, Frank, don't mock this. This is every woman's fantasy. Mark isn't just anyone. He's exceptional. He's a true gentleman, a star, a celebrity. I want to live the dream every woman fantasizes about. So please, Frank, show me that you love me by allowing me this experience," she pleaded. Frank struggled to manage his emotions in this unbelievable situation. "So tonight, you'll go to Lavalier, be intimate with him, and tomorrow, he'll return you home. Then we'll continue as a happily married couple, as if this never happened. Is that what you're saying, Brooke?" "It's not an affair. It's just one night," she responded, hoping Frank would believe her. "Yes, tomorrow I'll come back, and my dream will have come true. I'll be happy, and you'll be happy because you supported me in this. And we'll move on," she added. Frank was silent, contemplating her words. His voice shook with emotion as he responded, "So you're discarding me to be intimate with your charming prince, who you see as far superior to me? Damn, Brooke, that really hurts. Are you implying I'm not special? Not a real man?" he asked. "No, no, Frank. You are special. You are a real man," she exclaimed in distress. "Well, Brooke, then what did you mean?" he questioned. "I'm not a professional athlete or a celebrity who supposedly knows the secret to pleasing a woman sexually. Is that it?" he continued. Brooke looked down. "There's more to it," she murmured. "Then what's the issue?" he asked. "No, no, Frank. You're the greatest," she insisted. But again, Frank interrupted. "I'm the best, yet you still need someone else?" "Yes," she admitted, her gaze still averted. "So tonight, you acknowledge that the person you desire is Mark Lavalier?" Frank said, his voice pained. She conceded, still avoiding his gaze. "Yes, I've decided to spend the night with Mark. Engage in a night full of passion. It's not about love. I don't have feelings of love for him. But yes, I've decided to share an intimate moment with him and experience something a lot of women dream of," she stated firmly. Frank absorbed this information. "So you're distinguishing between love and physicality?" "Yes, Frank. I'm spending time with Mark due to physical attraction," she replied. Frank's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, each syllable sharp and deliberate. Brooke stood frozen, her heart hammering against her chest, as if it could burst free from the weight of her actions. She watched Frank, whose gaze was cold, yet seething with an intensity she'd never seen before. His body language spoke louder than any words, his fists clenched, jaw tight, and a dark storm cloud shadowing his face. "I won't interfere," Frank said, his voice low but cutting. "You're free to make your choices, Brooke. But remember, whatever you choose tonight, it ends here for us. No more pretending. This is the line." Brooke's stomach churned, the gravity of Frank's ultimatum sinking deeper into her bones. She wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, but the words felt trapped inside her, too heavy to voice. She'd already betrayed him with her actions, and now she had to face the reality of what her choices meant. The silence stretched between them like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. Her thoughts swirled in chaos. She had been so caught up in the whirlwind of desire and fantasy, the intoxicating allure of Mark, that she'd failed to see how deep her actions would wound the man who had been her everything. Frank, her husband, her partner, was now a stranger she feared she'd never understand again. His pain was etched in every line of his face, every tremble in his voice. Brooke's chest tightened as she took a step toward him, her heart reaching out in a desperate plea for understanding. "Frank, please. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was lost in a fantasy. I was foolish, but I never wanted to hurt you." Her voice cracked, and she fought to keep the tears from streaming down her face. But the ache in her chest was too much. The guilt, the shame, the heartbreak, they all collided, threatening to crush her. Frank didn't move. He didn't even blink. His eyes were locked onto hers, his anger simmering just beneath the surface, barely contained. "No, Brooke. You didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. You let yourself get swept up in it, didn't you? You let him manipulate you. You let him make you think that what you were doing, what you were willing to do, wasn't wrong." Her knees buckled slightly, and she found herself leaning against the nearest wall, trying to steady herself. I thought it was just a fantasy. I thought I could go through with it and still come back to you, as if nothing happened. But I was wrong. I see that now." She closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her words. "I'm sorry, Frank. I'm so sorry." Frank's expression softened, but there was no warmth in it, only a resigned sadness, a quiet acceptance that things had irreparably changed. "You made a choice, Brooke, and choices have consequences. You were ready to leave. You were ready to abandon what we built, just for a taste of something new, something exciting. You threw away everything we had for a fleeting moment with him." Brooke shook her head violently, tears now streaming down her face. "No, Frank. Please. I didn't throw us away. I didn't. It was just a mistake, just one night. It doesn't change what we have. It doesn't change how I feel about you." But Frank wasn't listening anymore. He was already processing the depths of her betrayal, the way she'd been so easily swayed by Mark, and how her justification had come too late. He couldn't accept it. The hurt was too raw, too deep to ignore. "You think I can just forget this? That I can forgive you and we can go on like nothing happened?" His voice had risen, thick with emotion. "You don't understand, Brooke. What you've done to me, it's beyond forgiveness. It's not just about sex or fantasy. It's about trust. It's about respect. And you shattered both of those with a single decision." Brooke collapsed onto the floor, her sobs uncontrollable, the reality of her actions crashing over her like an overwhelming wave. "I never wanted to hurt you, Frank. I never wanted this. I thought I could keep both worlds separate, but I can't. I can't live with myself knowing what I almost did. I can't lose you." Frank stood there, his back turned to her now, eyes closed in defeat. "You already have, Brooke. You already have." The silence that followed felt unbearable. Brooke lay on the floor, broken, unable to speak, her heart shattered beyond repair. What had she done? She'd thrown away everything for a night that now felt like a distant, nonsensical dream. She could never take it back. She could never undo the damage she'd caused. When Frank spoke again, his voice was steady, but cold. "I'll be waiting for you at home tomorrow, Brooke. I won't be here when you come back from Mark's. This, whatever this is, ends tonight." Brooke nodded silently, knowing the truth now, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Mark had won, Frank had lost, and she had to live with the consequences of her own choices. As she left, her body heavy with regret, the door closed behind her with a finality that echoed in her soul. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the night unfolded, each interaction driving a deeper wedge into the complicated web of betrayal and conflict. Frank stood there, fuming with rage, though his anger was carefully restrained. He could sense the danger of the situation, of Mark's looming threat, but there was something else burning in him, a deep ache from his shattered trust. He had been betrayed, not just by his wife, but by the choices she'd made, choices that had nearly cost him everything. He had no patience left for this charade for Mark, who now stood as a symbol of everything Frank had feared, someone who could take what was his without consequence. The coldness in his gaze told Brooke everything she needed to know about where Frank stood now. Despite his calm words, his actions spoke louder. He was done pretending. When the phone call came through, the tension in Frank's jaw tightened. He didn't hear the dialogue, but he didn't need to. The tone, the urgency in the voices, was enough to send waves of fury through his veins. When the call ended, Frank asked what had been said. The response was chilling. He said he would end you. Brooke's heart plummeted as she watched Frank absorb the weight of the words. She wanted to say something, to make it right, but how could she? Every moment felt like it had been a mistake, a choice that spiraled out of control. And as Frank acknowledged her words with a grim acceptance, she felt the loss between them growing, widening into something insurmountable. "Frank, I vow to you, after everything, I'll never allow another man near me," she whispered, the weight of her promise hanging in the air like an unspoken plea for forgiveness. Frank's response was brief, almost detached. "Okay, and when we socialize as we did tonight, I'll endeavor to assist you in maintaining that vow." His voice was tired, like he was already resigned to the reality of their relationship's unraveling. "I should have intervened before Laval snared you, but I failed. This fault lies with both of us, and also with Laval for pursuing a married woman." Brooke trembled at his words, but before she could respond, Frank continued, his gaze hardening. "I absolve you, but not Laval. I'll confront him eventually." The finality in his tone stunned her, and yet she understood. Mark, in his pursuit of her, had crossed a line that could never be undone. She didn't want him to suffer, but part of her knew deep down there had to be consequences for what he had done. As they moved toward the restaurant exit, the unease between them was palpable. Neither of them spoke until they were nearly outside, when Brooke finally broke the silence. "Do you wish you had ended him?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost afraid to hear the answer. Without hesitation, Frank's reply cut through the tension. "Yes," he said, the raw emotion in his voice impossible to ignore. His answer was definitive, final. There was no room for doubt in his mind. Brooke reflected on his words. She had always known that Frank was a man who carried his own brand of justice, a man who didn't take betrayal lightly. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about his swift decision to end Mark. It was a choice he had made, not out of a desire for vengeance, but out of a profound understanding of what was at stake. As they waited for the valet to retrieve their car, an SUV approached them rapidly. Frank tensed, his hand instinctively moving towards his side. Mark's voice boomed out of the vehicle, taunting, threatening, demanding that Brooke come with him. But Frank's response was immediate, sharp, and filled with authority. "She will not accompany you, Laval." The confrontation escalated quickly, with words exchanged, taunts thrown, and threats made. Frank knew this wasn't just a matter of words anymore. It was a matter of survival. Mark wasn't going to back down. He was a man consumed by rage, fueled by humiliation, and armed with a weapon. As the situation grew increasingly tense, Frank positioned himself between Mark and Brooke, hands raised, trying to de-escalate the violence that threatened to erupt. But Mark, filled with fury and drunk on his sense of superiority, wasn't listening. "I'll eliminate you," he shouted, his finger tightening on the trigger. What happened next was a blur. The sound of gunfire rang out, and Frank, trained and practiced, had already drawn his weapon in response. 2 shots. Quick. Precise. But before Mark could respond, a 3rd shot rang out from behind, striking him first. It wasn't Frank who had pulled the trigger, but an off-duty officer, a security guard who had been watching from the sidelines. Frank, startled, turned to find the officer lowering her weapon, her face grim as she assessed the situation. "I believe you've done it," Frank said, nodding towards a fallen Laval. The officer confirmed, her voice steady. "He was about to murder you." Mark, gasping for air, still tried to justify his actions. But even in his weakened state, it was clear he had lost. The officer's quick decision had spared Frank from being forced to take a life, but it had also sealed Mark's fate. His injuries were fatal, and as he lay on the ground, pleading for help, it was clear there would be no recovery. Brooke, watching the life drain from Mark's eyes, couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of the consequences. She had never wanted this. She had never wanted a man to die, least of all because of her. But the reality was undeniable. Mark had paid the price for his obsession with her, and now she had to face the aftermath. As the authorities arrived and the investigation unfolded, Frank and Brooke were left to grapple with the consequences of that night. They were both victims in their own way, but as the media swarmed and the questions mounted, Frank knew the public would never see it that way. They would see Mark Lavalier, the beloved sports hero, and the tragic end to his life. They would cast blame, and they would scrutinize. In the silence that followed, as they drove away from the chaos, Brooke asked, "Are you regretful that you didn't end him?" Frank's response was swift and blunt. Yes. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. He had made his choice, and it was final. Brooke, shaken by his certainty, began to question everything. She understood the complexities of Frank's world, the world where power, influence, and trust collided. But she also knew that the path they had chosen, the choices they had made, would come with a heavy price. As they continued driving, Brooke couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something darker, something more complicated than either of them could have anticipated. The emotional toll of the night, the weight of the violence, and the uncertainty about their future loomed heavy in the air, leaving both of them to wonder. Where would they go from here?